A boy in the shadows. Dr. Patricia Monroe sighed deeply as she stepped out of the hospital's emergency entrance. The cool night air wrapped around her like a comforting embrace after an exhausting shift. It had been one of those grueling nights. Broken bones, heart attacks, and too many patients with no place to go once they were discharged. Her body ached, and her mind was heavy with fatigue, but she was grateful for the few minutes of peace as she walked toward the parking lot. Then she saw him, a small figure huddled near the hospital's stone wall, barely illuminated by the dim overhead light. At first, she thought it was just another lost soul, another homeless person seeking shelter near the warmth of the building. But as she stepped closer, her breath caught. It was a child. A boy, no older than 8 or 9, curled up on the cold concrete, his head resting on his thin arm. His small frame was wrapped in a tattered hoodie, his sneakers barely holding together. Even in sleep, his face was tense, as if carrying the weight of the world. Patricia's chest tightened. What was a child doing out here alone at this hour? Her medical instincts took over, and she crouched beside him, careful not to startle him. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly. "Are you okay?" The boy stirred slightly, but his eyes remained closed. Up close, she noticed the exhaustion on his young face, the deep hollows under his eyes, the dirt smudged across his cheeks. He looked like he hadn't had a proper meal or bath in days. A wave of guilt washed over Patricia. How many times had she walked out of this hospital and missed seeing him? Had he been here before? Had others passed him by, assuming someone else would help? She hesitated for a moment. This was complicated. She was off duty. She wasn't a social worker. And yet, walking away felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. With a deep breath, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small protein bar. She gently placed it next to him before standing up. "I'll be back," she whispered, hoping he could hear her. As she walked to her car, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her gut. Something about the boy tugged at her, making it impossible to let it go. That night, sleep was elusive. Every time Patricia closed her eyes, she saw his face, small, vulnerable, alone. She had to do something. Part 2. The first conversation. The next evening, after another long shift, Patricia found herself hurrying out of the hospital doors with one purpose: to see if the boy was still there. Her heart clenched when she saw him in the same spot, curled up tightly against the cold night air. This time, she didn't hesitate. She approached slowly, kneeling down beside him again. "Hey there," she said gently. "Can I sit with you?" The boy stirred and blinked up at her, his dark brown eyes wide and wary. He tensed as if preparing to run. Patricia raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "It's okay. I just want to talk." His gaze flickered to the protein bar she had left him the night before. It was gone. Good. At least he ate. "I'd brought more snacks," she continued, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small juice box and a sandwich. She set them on the ground between them. The boy hesitated before slowly sitting up, his small hands grabbing the juice first. He sipped it cautiously, watching her. Patricia smiled. "My name is Patricia. I work here at the hospital. What's your name?" The boy hesitated, then mumbled, "Omari." Patricia's heart ached at how soft his voice was, like he wasn't used to speaking to anyone. "That's a beautiful name, Omari." She waited a moment before asking, "Are you here alone?" Omari looked down, fiddling with the hem of his hoodie. "I'm waiting for my mom," he whispered. Patricia's stomach twisted. Waiting? Has she been inside the hospital? Omari nodded slowly. "She told me to wait here. She said she'd come back." "How long have you been waiting?" He hesitated. "A while." Patricia's pulse quickened. "A while. Days? Weeks?" She glanced back at the hospital, her mind racing through possibilities. If his mother had been admitted, there should be records. But why hadn't she come back for him? Patricia's heart ached for the child sitting before her, clutching a juice box like it was the only thing anchoring him. "I want to help you, Omari," she said softly. "But I need to know more. Do you have any other family? Anyone you can stay with?" Omari shook his head. "Just me and Mom." His words hit her like a brick. Just him and his mother. And she wasn't coming back. Patricia took a slow, deep breath. She had to be careful. This was delicate. "Omari," she said, keeping her voice steady, "would it be okay if I check on your mom inside the hospital? Maybe I can find out when she'll be back." Omari hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." Patricia forced a reassuring smile. "Stay here. I'll be right back." But as she hurried back inside, dread settled deep in her chest. She already knew. She wasn't going to find good news. Part 3. A Mother's Secret. Patricia logged into the hospital's records system, her fingers trembling as she typed. Sharon Williams. Her gut twisted when the name appeared. Admitted. 3 weeks ago. Diagnosis. Stage IV cancer. Status. Deceased. Patricia's world blurred. She gripped the desk, struggling to breathe. 3 weeks ago, the boy outside had been waiting. Alone, for 3 weeks, expecting his mother to return. Tears burned at her eyes. How could this happen? How had no one noticed? Patricia took a shaky breath, forcing herself to focus. There had to be something. Some family. Some emergency contact. She scrolled through the file. Next of kin, none listed. Patricia felt her knees go weak. There was no one. Omari had no one. She pressed a hand over her mouth, fighting back the tears. She had seen many tragedies in her career. But this felt personal. How do you tell a child his mother is never coming back? She wasn't sure she could. As she stepped back outside, her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Omari sat exactly where she had left him, swinging his legs, waiting. His eyes brightened when he saw her. "Did you find her?" he asked eagerly. Patricia's breath hitched. Her voice failed her. Omari looked up at her expectantly. She swallowed the lump in her throat. He deserves to know. He deserves the truth. But how do you break a child's heart without shattering his whole world? Patricia knelt down, taking his small hands in hers. "Omari," she began, her voice shaking. "I have something to tell you." Omari's smile faded. His little fingers tightened around hers. And then, with all the gentleness she could muster, Patricia spoke the words that would change both of their lives forever. Shattered hope. Omari's small fingers trembled in Patricia's grasp. His deep brown eyes, filled with hope, searched hers for reassurance. But there was none. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "What is it, Dr. Patricia?" Omari asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Patricia swallowed hard. She had delivered bad news before, to families, to loved ones standing in hospital corridors, to patients whose conditions had no cure. But nothing had ever felt as impossible as this. She squeezed Omari's hands gently. "Sweetheart, I looked for your mom in the hospital's records." Omari sat up straighter, his expression hopeful. "And, is she coming back soon?" Patricia's chest ached. She forced herself to keep looking into his innocent eyes, even as she felt her own welling with tears. "Omari, your mom. She was very sick." Omari's face changed. The hope flickered, just for a second, replaced by something guarded, something fearful. She didn't tell me she was sick," he murmured, his voice small. Patricia's grip on his hands tightened. "I know, sweetheart. She probably wanted to protect you." Omari shook his head, his face twisting in confusion. But she said she'd come back. She told me to wait." Patricia's throat tightened. She wanted to. "Omari, she loved you so much, but she passed away a few weeks ago." The words hung in the air like a bomb. Omari blinked. Then again. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. He simply stared at her, unmoving, unblinking, as if she had spoken a language he couldn't understand. Then, slowly, his small hand slipped from hers. "No," he whispered, his voice cracked like glass. "No, that's not true." Patricia felt her own tears breaking free. "Omari," she promised. His voice rose, shaking with anger and disbelief. "She promised me. She said she'd come back. She wouldn't lie to me. You're lying." Omari shot to his feet, stumbling backward, his chest heaving. His small fists clenched, his entire body shaking with the force of his grief. Patricia wanted to reach for him, to pull him into her arms, but she knew he would push her away. He wasn't ready. He was drowning in a truth too painful to bear. Tears streaked his cheeks, but he furiously wiped them away with the sleeve of his worn hoodie. "She can't be gone," he muttered, shaking his head violently. She just needs more time. She told me to wait. She wouldn't leave me." Patricia felt helpless. "Omari, But before she could finish, Omari turned and ran. "Omari," she called, panic surging through her. But the boy was fast, his thin frame darting around the corner of the hospital, disappearing into the night. Patricia's heart pounded as she jumped to her feet. She had to find him. A desperate search. Patricia ran through the hospital parking lot, her eyes scanning every shadow. The night was cold, the wind cutting through her thin scrubs. Where had he gone? A child, alone at this hour. It wasn't safe. She sprinted past the emergency entrance, past the ambulance bay, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Her mind raced with terrible possibilities. What if he ran into the street? What if someone took him? What if? No, she had to find him. She stopped suddenly, listening. Then she heard it. Soft, muffled sobs. Patricia turned toward the hospital garden, a small, quiet space with benches and trees, meant to give patients and families a moment of peace. She followed the sound. And then she saw him. Omari was curled up on the ground beneath a tree, his knees drawn to his chest, his tiny shoulders shaking with silent cries. Patricia's heart broke all over again. She approached slowly, kneeling beside him. "Omari," she said softly. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry." He didn't look up. He just shook his head. "I don't know what to do," he choked out between sobs. "She was all I had." Patricia's own tears slipped down her cheeks. "I know, sweetheart. I know." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the leaves above them. The city sounds distant in the night. Finally, Omari's voice broke the silence. "Where will I go now?" Patricia felt her throat tighten. She had no easy answer. "We'll figure it out," she promised. Omari sniffled, finally looking up at her, his dark eyes swimming with pain. "I don't want to go to a shelter. I don't want to go with strangers." Patricia reached out, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "You won't be alone, Omari. I'll make sure of that." Omari studied her for a moment, his face filled with uncertainty. Then, in a hesitant, broken motion, he leaned into her. Patricia wrapped her arms around him, holding him close as his tiny body trembled against hers. In that moment, she knew. She couldn't let this boy slip through the cracks of the system. She couldn't walk away. Omari needed someone. And maybe, just maybe, she needed him too. A new beginning. Patricia didn't go home that night. Instead, she signed herself back in as an on-call doctor, giving her an excuse to stay near the hospital. She found a spare blanket in the supply room and brought Omari into one of the empty waiting rooms, letting him curl up on the small couch. She sat beside him, watching over him as he drifted into a fitful sleep. Her mind raced. She had always been dedicated to her job, working long hours, sacrificing relationships, telling herself she didn't have time for anything else. But now, looking at the sleeping boy beside her, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe she had been waiting for something, someone, without even realizing it. The next morning, as the sun rose, Patricia knew what she had to do. She had a shift starting in an hour, but first, she needed to make a phone call. She took a deep breath and dialed the number for social services. "Hello, A woman's voice answered. "This is Dr. Patricia Monroe from City Hospital," she said, steadying her voice. "I have a young boy here, and I'd like to talk about the possibility of temporary guardianship." As the woman on the other end began to explain the process, Patricia glanced at Omari, still asleep, his face finally at peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let him face it alone. The promise. The early morning light streamed through the hospital's tinted windows, casting long shadows across the waiting room where Omari lay curled up under a thin blanket. His small body was tucked into the corner of the couch, as if trying to make himself invisible. His breathing was slow, but not peaceful. Even in sleep, his tiny hands gripped the fabric of his hoodie, as if holding on to something. Someone who was no longer there. Patricia sat beside him, her phone still in her hand, the call with social services weighing heavily on her mind. The woman on the other end had been polite but firm. "We appreciate your concern, Dr. Monroe, but the child needs to be placed with the proper authorities. We'll send someone to the hospital within the next 24 hours to assess his case." Patricia had thanked her and hung up, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. She looked at Omari's sleeping form, his face soft, his cheeks still damp from the tears of the night before. A knot formed in her stomach. She knew how the system worked. She had seen children like Omari before, kids with no family, no advocate. They ended up shuffled from place to place, waiting for homes that might never come, lost in the bureaucracy. She couldn't let that happen to him. A quiet knock at the waiting room door made Patricia look up. Nurse Helen, a seasoned veteran of the hospital staff, peeked inside. "You've been here all night, haven't you?" Helen asked, stepping into the room and glancing at Omari with a mixture of sympathy and concern. Patricia ran a hand through her hair, nodding. "I couldn't leave him." Helen sighed, folding her arms. "Social services called the front desk. They'll be sending someone later today." Patricia clenched her jaw. "I don't want him going into the system, Helen. He's been through too much." Helen studied her for a long moment. "You really care about this boy?" Patricia swallowed, surprised by how much those words struck her. She wasn't just a doctor treating a patient. She wasn't just offering temporary comfort. She cared, deeply. "I don't know what it is," Patricia admitted, "but something about him. I can't turn away." Helen nodded knowingly. "Then maybe you shouldn't." Patricia's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Helen sat down next to her, her voice gentle. "You have options, Patricia. If you want to help him, really help him, you could apply for emergency guardianship." Patricia exhaled sharply. "You think they'd let me?" Helen gave her a knowing look. "You're a respected doctor, you have a stable home, and you clearly care about the kid. That's more than a lot of people in his situation get." Patricia glanced down at Omari again, her pulse quickening. Could she do it? Could she really take responsibility for a child? She had always been married to her job, her career taking precedence over everything else. But looking at Omari now, she realized something startling. For the first time in years, she wanted something outside of work. She wanted him to be safe. She wanted to be the person who gave him a home. Patricia took a deep breath and met Helen's gaze. "What do I need to do?" Helen smiled. "First, you need to tell social services that you're applying for emergency foster placement. Then you need to fill out the forms. And after that," she nodded toward Omari, "you need to tell him. A child's trust." Later that morning, as Omari rubbed the sleep from his eyes, Patricia knelt beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly. Omari blinked up at her, his face still clouded with exhaustion and sadness. "Morning." She hesitated, then reached for his small hand, squeezing it gently. "I talked to some people about what's going to happen next." Omari tensed. "Are they gonna take me away?" Patricia's heart clenched. She could hear the fear in his voice, the same fear so many kids in his situation felt. She shook her head. "Not if I can help it." Omari stared at her, his brows furrowed. What do you mean? Patricia inhaled deeply. This was it. I want you to stay with me, Omari, she said, her voice steady. For now. At least until we figure things out. I don't want you to go somewhere scary or be with strangers. I want to take care of you. Omari's eyes widened. He sat up slightly, as if trying to process her words. You want me to stay? Patricia nodded. Only if you want to. Silence stretched between them. Omari's hands gripped the blanket in his lap, his small fingers tightening around the fabric. Then, slowly, his lip quivered. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. I don't want to be alone. Patricia's throat burned with emotion. You won't be. I promise. Without warning, Omari lunged forward, wrapping his thin arms around her neck. Patricia held him tightly, feeling the way his tiny body trembled against hers. For the first time since she had met him, Omari allowed himself to hope. Facing the system, the meeting with the social worker wasn't easy. Miss Johnson, the woman assigned to Omari's case, was polite but firm. Dr. Monroe, we appreciate your willingness to help, she said, flipping through a thick folder of paperwork. But emergency guardianship requires a thorough background check, home visits, and approval from the court. Patricia had expected this. I understand, and I'm prepared for it. Miss Johnson adjusted her glasses. You're a single woman with a demanding career. Do you think you have the time and resources to properly care for a child? Patricia glanced at Omari, who sat beside her in the hospital's family meeting room, his small hands folded in his lap. She knew what this woman was asking. Was she enough? Patricia took a deep breath. I know it won't be easy, but I care about Omari, and I want to be the one who gives him a home. Miss Johnson studied her carefully. After a moment, she sighed. We'll start the process, but be prepared. There will be challenges. Patricia nodded. Whatever it takes. Miss Johnson turned to Omari. How do you feel about staying with Dr. Monroe? Omari glanced at Patricia, his eyes cautious but hopeful. I trust her, he said simply. Patricia felt something inside her crack open. She wasn't just trying to save a boy. She was becoming his home. A new home. That evening, as Patricia unlocked the door to her apartment, she glanced down at Omari, who stood beside her, his backpack slung over his shoulder. Are you ready? She asked. Omari nodded but didn't say anything. She pushed open the door. The apartment was warm and inviting, with soft yellow lights casting a gentle glow. It wasn't a mansion, but it was home. And now, it was his. Omari hesitated in the doorway. Is there a place for me? Patricia knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from his face. Come see. She led him down the hall to a small bedroom. Inside was a twin bed with clean blue sheets, a nightstand with a lamp, and a bookshelf filled with stories waiting to be read. Omari's mouth opened slightly. This is mine, he whispered. Patricia smiled. All yours. For a moment, Omari stood frozen. Then, slowly, he stepped inside, running his hands along the bed, the books, the small desk by the window. He turned back to Patricia, his eyes wide. Thank you, he said softly. Patricia's throat tightened. You're welcome, sweetheart. Omari hesitated, then took a deep breath. Can I call you Mom? He asked quietly. Patricia's heart nearly stopped. She knelt down, her hands on his small shoulders, her eyes swimming with tears. You can call me whatever you want, Omari. Omari smiled, small but real. And for the first time in weeks, he felt something he thought he had lost forever. Home. A fragile beginning. The first night in her apartment, Omari didn't sleep. Patricia knew because she had been awake too, listening. She had tucked him into bed, given him a nightlight, and even left his door slightly open, just in case he needed her. But in the quiet hours past midnight, she heard the soft rustling of sheets, the creak of the bed frame, and the faint sound of him shifting over and over again. At first, she thought he was simply restless, But then came the muffled sniffles. Patricia's heart clenched. She got out of bed, grabbed a spare blanket, and made her way to Omari's room. Peeking inside, she found him curled up, his back to the door, his small body trembling. "Omari," she called softly. There was a long pause before he answered. "I can't sleep." Patricia hesitated, then stepped inside. "Do you want to talk about it?" Omari shook his head. But then, after a moment, he whispered, "It's too quiet." Patricia frowned. Too quiet. Omari turned slightly, just enough for her to see his tear-streaked face. At the hospital, there was always noise. The beeping machines, the doctors talking. I could hear people. I didn't feel alone. Patricia's throat tightened. He wasn't used to peace. He had found comfort in the chaos because at least it meant life was moving around him. She thought for a moment, then walked to the bookshelf in the corner of his room. Pulling out a small Bluetooth speaker, she set it on the nightstand. "Do you like music?" she asked. Omari shrugged. "I guess." Patricia pulled out her phone, searching through playlists. After a moment, she found a soft instrumental track, gentle piano notes mixed with the distant sound of rain. She pressed play, and the quiet hum of music filled the room. Omari listened for a moment, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Then, slowly, he lay back down. Patricia sat on the edge of his bed. "Better." Omari gave a small nod. "Yeah." Patricia brushed a stray curl from his forehead. "You're safe here, sweetheart. You can rest." Omari's breathing slowed. His fingers, which had been gripping his blanket tightly, relaxed. For the first time, he let himself close his eyes. Patricia stayed until his breaths became steady. Only then did she whisper, "Good night, Omari." And for the first time since she had met him, she saw him truly at peace. A new routine. Mornings with Omari were slow at first. He wasn't used to waking up to breakfast waiting for him. The first time Patricia placed a plate of pancakes in front of him, he simply stared at it. "You don't like pancakes?" she asked. Omari shook his head. I didn't think about food. At the hospital, I ate whatever the nurses gave me. When I was outside, I didn't eat much." Patricia's heart ached, but she kept her voice light. "Well, get used to it. Because here, you'll have pancakes, eggs, toast, or whatever else you want." Omari hesitated. Then, slowly, he picked up the fork. That morning, he ate everything on his plate. Each day, small changes took place. Omari started leaving his room more. At first, he lingered in the hallway, watching Patricia as she moved around. Then he started helping, setting the table, carrying plates, folding blankets. He didn't talk much, but Patricia never pushed. She let him move at his own pace. One afternoon, she found him flipping through one of the books on the living room shelf. "You like to read?" she asked. Omari shrugged. "I used to. My mom would read to me before bed." Patricia smiled. "Would you like me to read to you?" Omari's eyes flickered with uncertainty. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. That night, Patricia read him a chapter of Charlotte's Web, and by the end of the week, he was the one picking the books. A shadow of the past. Not everything was easy. Omari had nightmares. Some nights, Patricia would wake to the sound of his muffled cries. When she rushed to his room, she found him thrashing in his bed, his face twisted in fear. One night, she reached for him, only for him to jerk awake with a scream. His chest heaved, his eyes wide and glassy with terror. It took several seconds before he registered where he was. "Omari," Patricia whispered, kneeling beside his bed. "It's okay. You're safe." Omari pressed his hands to his eyes, shaking his head. I saw her." Patricia's breath hitched. "Your mom." Omari nodded, his small frame trembling. "She was calling me. But I couldn't reach her." Patricia felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached out, taking his hands in hers. "I know it hurts, sweetheart. I wish I could take that pain away." Omari sniffled. "I keep thinking, Maybe if I had done something different, maybe if I had been good, she wouldn't have left. Patricia's heart shattered. She cupped his face gently. Omari, listen to me. None of this was your fault. Your mom loved you more than anything in this world. Tears spilled down his cheeks. Then why did she leave me? Patricia's own eyes burned with emotion. She didn't want to. She fought so hard to stay with you. But sometimes, even love isn't enough to stop what's happening inside our bodies. Omari let out a shaky breath. I miss her. Patricia wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. I know, sweetheart. And that's okay. You don't have to stop missing her. But I promise you, you'll never be alone. Omari clung to her. And for the first time, he let himself believe it. An unexpected letter. One evening, as Patricia sorted through the mail, she came across a small envelope. Her breath caught when she saw the sender's name. Sharon Williams. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Patricia, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. I know it's unfair of me to ask this of you, but I have no choice. Omari has no one else. I need you to take care of him. Not just for me, but for him. He's smart. He's kind. He's been through too much already. I wanted to tell him myself, but I was too scared. Please, love him, protect him, give him the life I couldn't. And tell him I never stopped loving him. Sharon. Patricia's vision blurred with tears. She clutched the letter to her chest, her heart aching. Sharon had known. Even before the end, she had known she wouldn't make it. And she had chosen Patricia to be Omari's home. Taking a shaky breath, Patricia wiped her tears. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small box, the first thing that would belong to Omari's new life. She walked to his room, standing in the doorway. Omari sat cross-legged on his bed, flipping through a book. Patricia cleared her throat. Hey, sweetheart. Omari looked up. Patricia smiled, warmth filling her heart. Do you want to go out for ice cream? Omari blinked, then hesitated before smiling softly. Yeah, I'd like that. Patricia nodded. As they left the apartment together, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. No matter what happened next, she wasn't going to fail him. Because this wasn't just a temporary arrangement. Omari was her family. And she would fight for him, no matter what it took. A bond strengthened. The ice cream parlor was quiet, the warm glow of its neon sign flickering against the cool evening air. It had been years since Patricia had stepped inside a place like this. Not since she was a teenager, laughing over Sundays with her best friend, Sharon. Now she was here with Sharon's son. Omari hesitated as they walked inside, his small hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. His eyes darted around, as if expecting someone to tell him he didn't belong. Patricia placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. It's okay, sweetheart. You can get whatever you want. Omari looked up at her, uncertain. Even 2 scoops. Patricia smiled. Even 3. A small smile tugged at Omari's lips, the first real one she had seen in days. As he stepped forward to examine the flavors, Patricia studied him carefully. He was still so guarded, so careful, but there was a light in his eyes now, a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Hope. The cashier, a cheerful college student, greeted them with a warm smile. What'll it be, little man? Omari hesitated, then pointed. Chocolate and cookie dough. In a cone. Patricia chuckled. Excellent choice. She ordered a scoop of vanilla for herself, and together, they took a seat by the window. For a few minutes, there was only silence between them as Omari slowly licked his ice cream, his small fingers gripping the cone tightly, as if afraid it might be taken from him. Patricia watched him, feeling the weight of the letter in her pocket. She wanted to tell him about it, about Sharon's final words. But was he ready? Was she? Omari broke the silence first. Did my mom like ice cream? Patricia blinked, surprised by the question. She smiled softly. She loved it, but she always got the weirdest flavors. like mango and chili or lavender honey. Omari wrinkled his nose. That sounds gross. Patricia laughed. That's what I told her. But she always made me try a bite. Omari's lips twitched. Did you like it? Patricia sighed dramatically. Nope. Hated it. But she always laughed when I made a face. Omari chuckled. Really chuckled. And Patricia felt something warm bloom in her chest. I wish I remembered more stuff about her, Omari admitted after a moment, his voice quieter. Patricia reached across the table and gently took his free hand. I can tell you everything I remember, sweetheart. Whenever you want. Omari looked down at their hands, then nodded. Okay. It wasn't much. But it was a start. A step toward healing. That night, after they returned home, Patricia found Omari sitting in the living room, staring at the framed pictures on the bookshelf. They were mostly of her family, her parents, her medical school graduation, a few old vacation snapshots. Where's your mom? Omari asked suddenly. Patricia froze. She hadn't thought about that question in a long time. She passed away a few years ago, she said softly, walking over to sit beside him. Omari's brow furrowed. Did it hurt? Patricia swallowed, remembering the dull, aching grief that had followed her for months after her mother was gone. Yeah, it did. Omari glanced at her. Does it still? Patricia nodded. Sometimes, but I think about the good memories too. That helps. Omari was quiet for a long time. Then he whispered, What if I forget her? Patricia's heart clenched. She reached out, brushing a curl from his forehead. You won't. You'll always remember the way she loved you, and I'll help you keep her memory alive. Okay. Omari hesitated, then gave a small nod. After a moment, he leaned against her, resting his head on her arm. Patricia exhaled, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. For the first time, he let himself be comforted. And for the first time, Patricia felt like maybe, just maybe, she was becoming the person he needed. The ghosts that linger. The weeks passed in a quiet rhythm. Mornings with breakfast, afternoons with books, evenings filled with slow conversations and careful laughter. Omari began to settle in, but there were still moments of silence, of shadows. One evening, Patricia found Omari sitting in the hallway, knees drawn to his chest. She crouched beside him. What's wrong, sweetheart? Omari stared at the floor. It still doesn't feel real. That she's gone. Patricia sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his. Grief doesn't have a schedule. It doesn't go away overnight. Omari swallowed. When does it stop hurting? Patricia sighed, looking at the ceiling. I don't know if it ever completely stops, but it gets easier to carry. Omari shifted, his small fingers tugging at the hem of his shirt. Sometimes I pretend she's still here. Like, if I close my eyes really hard, I can almost hear her voice. Patricia's throat tightened. That's okay. You can do that, as long as you need to. Omari was quiet for a moment. Then, hesitantly, he whispered, Would you tell me a story about her? Patricia smiled, even as tears pricked her eyes. And so, in the dim light of the hallway, she told him about the time Sharon had tried to bake a cake for a school fundraiser and nearly burned down the kitchen. Omari laughed. A real, deep, joyful laugh. And Patricia knew he was healing. A future worth fighting for. One afternoon, Patricia got a call. It was Miss Johnson from Social Services. We've reviewed your application, she said, and we'd like to move forward with your temporary guardianship. Patricia's breath hitched. You mean? Yes, you'll be Omari's legal guardian while we conduct a full evaluation for permanent placement. Patricia swallowed the lump in her throat. And if I want to adopt him? Miss Johnson hesitated. That process takes longer, but given your bond with him, I'd say it's a strong possibility. Patricia closed her eyes, emotion swelling in her chest. Thank you. After she hung up, she turned to Omari, who was sitting on the couch, drawing absent-mindedly in a notebook. What's up? He asked, Noticing the expression on her face, Patricia sat beside him. "I have some news." Omari frowned. "Bad news." Patricia shook her head, reaching for his hand. "They said I can be your guardian." Omari's eyes widened. "Like, for real?" Patricia smiled. "For real." Omari was still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he whispered, "Does that mean I can stay?" Patricia's heart nearly broke. She squeezed his hand. "Yes, sweetheart, you can stay." A breath of relief escaped Omari's lips. He ducked his head, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Then, without warning, he threw himself into her arms. Patricia held him tightly, her own tears slipping free. He wasn't just a boy she had found outside the hospital. He was her boy now, and she would never let him go. The battle for forever. The day Patricia officially became Omari's guardian was both a victory and the beginning of a new battle. The temporary guardianship papers were signed. A social worker came by to inspect her home, checking for safety and stability. Everything was in order. But Patricia knew the real fight wasn't over. Temporary meant exactly that, temporary. There was still a long road ahead before Omari could be hers forever. And the system. It wasn't built for quick, clean endings. She had seen it before. Children lost in the shuffle, pushed from one home to another, waiting for court dates that dragged on for months. Some never found a permanent place. They aged out, alone, forgotten. Patricia swore she wouldn't let that happen to Omari. She would fight. No matter what it took. Adjusting to normal. Normal was a foreign concept to Omari. For so long, his life had been a blur of hospital rooms, cold concrete, and uncertainty. Now, he was waking up in the same bed every morning, eating breakfast at the same table, coming home to the same warm place every evening. At first, he walked through each day like he was waiting for the rug to be pulled from under him, like he didn't quite believe it would last. Patricia saw it in the little things, how he flinched when she said she'd be home after work, as if he wasn't sure she would come back, how he always kept his backpack packed, like he was ready to leave at a moment's notice, like he was still waiting to be abandoned. One night, as they were washing dishes after dinner, Patricia finally asked, "Omari, do you like living here?" Omari hesitated, setting down his plate carefully in the drying rack. "Yeah." Patricia dried her hands on a towel. "Then why do you still keep your bag packed every night?" Omari's fingers twitched at his sides. He shifted, staring at the floor. I don't know." Patricia crouched down, meeting his eyes. "Are you afraid I'm going to send you away?" Omari swallowed. "I don't want to get too comfortable," he admitted, "in case it doesn't last." Patricia's heart clenched. She reached out, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sweetheart, listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you." Omari looked at her, his eyes clouded with hesitation. "But what if?" "There's no what if," Patricia said firmly. "This is your home, for as long as you want it to be." Omari searched her face, his small body stiff with tension. Then, after a long pause, he whispered, "Promise." Patricia's throat tightened. She nodded. "Promise." For the first time since coming to live with her, Omari unzipped his backpack and unpacked it. The fight for forever. Patricia didn't waste time. The day after Omari unpacked his bag, she scheduled a meeting with a family attorney. "This isn't just about being his guardian," she explained as she sat in the lawyer's office. "I want to adopt him." The lawyer, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a patient smile, folded her hands on the desk. "Adoption is a long process, Dr. Monroe. Are you prepared for that?" Patricia didn't hesitate. "Yes." The lawyer nodded. "Then let's start." They went through every step. Paperwork, background checks, home evaluations. Patricia was ready for it all. What she wasn't ready for? The complications. A week later, a caseworker called. "There's an issue," she said, her voice careful. "Omari's biological father is listed on his birth certificate." Patricia felt her stomach drop. His father. But Sharon told me there was no one. The caseworker sighed. There was. We don't know where he is. But legally, we have to make an effort to contact him before moving forward with adoption. Patricia gripped the phone tighter. And if we can't find him, then you'll have to go through the courts to have his rights terminated. Patricia closed her eyes. This was going to be harder than she thought. The ghost of a man long gone. Omari's father was a ghost. There was no recent address, no work history, no contact number. The last record of him was from 5 years ago, a brief arrest for unpaid fines. Then, nothing. The caseworker sent letters to his last known address. No response. Patricia hired a private investigator, desperate for answers. A month passed. Then another. Still nothing. Each time Omari saw Patricia on the phone, filling out more paperwork, he grew quieter. One night, as she was tucking him into bed, he finally asked, "What if they find him?" Patricia sighed, sitting beside him. "I don't know." Omari picked at his blanket. "What if he wants me?" The question felt like a punch to the gut. Patricia didn't know the answer. She didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want him to be afraid. She reached out, running a gentle hand through his curls. "Then we'll figure it out together." Omari bit his lip. "What if I don't want him?" Patricia's heart ached. "Then we'll fight." Omari nodded, pressing his face into his pillow. Patricia sat beside him, watching him breathe. She had never wanted anything more than she wanted to be his mother, and she would fight for it, no matter how long it took. The waiting game. Time crawled. Weeks turned into months. Still no response from Omari's father. Finally, after 6 months of dead ends, Patricia's lawyer filed a petition with the court. If no one claims parental rights within the next 90 days, the lawyer explained, the court will move forward with adoption. Patricia exhaled slowly, and then, the lawyer smiled. "Then he's yours." Patricia gripped Omari's hand as they left the office. 3 more months. That's all they had to wait. But Omari wasn't convinced. "What if something happens?" he asked as they drove home. "What if they change their mind?" Patricia squeezed his hand. "They won't. Just a little longer, sweetheart." Omari nodded, but his grip on her hand didn't loosen. He still wasn't sure. Not yet. The courtroom and the truth. The day of the final hearing, Patricia dressed Omari in his best clothes. A simple navy button-down, dark jeans, shoes that fit him properly. He fidgeted as they walked into the courtroom. Patricia held his hand tightly. When the judge entered, Patricia's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The lawyer presented their case. The judge listened carefully, flipping through the thick stack of documents. Then he looked at Omari. "Son, do you want this?" The judge asked gently. "Do you want Dr. Monroe to be your mother?" Omari's hands clenched at his sides. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally he lifted his chin and said, "She already is." Patricia's breath hitched. The judge smiled. "Then let's make it official." With a bang of the gavel, it was done. Omari Monroe, her son. Forever. A home that lasts. That night, back at their apartment, Omari sat at the kitchen table, staring at his new birth certificate. His name. Patricia's name. Together. Patricia knelt beside him, brushing a tear from his cheek. "What are you thinking, sweetheart?" Omari looked up, his eyes shining. "I don't have to leave." Patricia smiled, cupping his face. "Never." Omari took a shaky breath. Then, "Can I ask something?" "Of course." Omari hesitated, then whispered, "Can I call you Mom now?" Patricia's heart broke and healed all at once. She pulled him into her arms, holding him tight. "You can call me whatever you want." Omari buried his face in her shoulder and whispered, "Mom." Patricia closed her eyes. He was home. Forever. A forever home. Patricia never thought one word could change her life. But the first time Omari called her mom, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just a title. It wasn't just a word. It was a promise. A promise that he was safe, that he was loved, that he would never be alone again. Aunt Patricia. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone either. But the journey wasn't over. A piece of paper made their family official, but healing. That would take time. Omari had been through too much to trust that happiness would last, and Patricia knew that love wasn't just about saying the right words. It was about showing up, every single day. And that's exactly what she planned to do. The first days as a real family. The morning after the adoption hearing, Patricia woke up to an unfamiliar sound. Laughter. It took her a second to realize where she was, to remember that Omari was now hers, legally and forever. She stepped into the hallway and saw him sitting at the kitchen table, laughing at something on TV as he munched on toast. It was such a simple moment, but to Patricia, it meant everything. "You're up early," she said, smiling. Omari grinned, a piece of toast hanging from his mouth. "Didn't want to waste my first day as your son." Patricia's chest tightened with warmth. She walked over, ruffling his curls before sitting down across from him. "Well, in that case, what do you want to do today?" Omari paused, thinking. "Can we do something normal?" Patricia tilted her head. "Like what?" Omari shrugged. "I dunno. People always talk about stuff like movie nights or going to the park. Just normal family stuff." Patricia smiled. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." That day, they did everything. A trip to the park, where Omari climbed the jungle gym and raced through the grass. A visit to a bookstore, where he picked out 3 books for later. Ice cream at their favorite spot. And finally, a movie night, complete with popcorn and blankets. Omari fell asleep on the couch, curled up against her side. Patricia looked down at him, brushing a curl from his forehead. This is what he deserves. This is what he should have always had. And now she was going to make sure he never lost it again. The nightmares don't end overnight. As wonderful as things were, healing wasn't instant. Some nights, the past still crept in. One evening, Patricia woke up to the sound of crying. She rushed into Omari's room and found him curled up in his bed, tears streaking down his cheeks. His small body trembled, and his breathing came in short, panicked gasps. "Omari," Patricia whispered, kneeling beside him. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe." Omari shook his head, his fingers twisting in his sheets. I saw her again." Patricia's heart clenched. She didn't have to ask who. "She was calling me," Omari whispered. "But I couldn't find her. I tried, I really tried. But—" His voice broke. Patricia pulled him into her arms, holding him close. "It's okay, sweetheart. It was just a dream." Omari buried his face in her shoulder. It felt real. Patricia rubbed soothing circles on his back. "I know, but you're here now. And she wouldn't want you to be afraid." Omari sniffled. "What if I forget her?" Patricia pulled back, cupping his small face in her hands. "You won't. She's a part of you. Always." Omari hesitated, then whispered, "I miss her." Patricia felt a lump rise in her throat. "I know, sweetheart." She held him until his breathing slowed, until the tears stopped, until he finally drifted back to sleep, still holding onto her hand. His first real holiday. A month after the adoption, something new happened. Omari got excited. It started when they walked past a store with bright red and green decorations in the window. Christmas. Patricia had never thought much about the holidays before. She had always been too busy with work. But now she had a son. And when Omari's eyes lit up at the decorations, Patricia knew she had to make this Christmas special. That weekend, they bought a tree. Omari picked it out himself, insisting on one that was slightly too big for their living room. They decorated together, stringing up lights and hanging ornaments. And when it was done, Omari stood back grinning. "I've never had a real Christmas tree before," he admitted softly. Patricia's heart clenched. "Well, this is just the beginning," she promised. She took him ice skating. He fell a lot, but laughed every time. They made gingerbread houses, or tried to, before Omari ate half the candy. They even went shopping for presents, because for the first time, Omari had people he wanted to give gifts to. And on Christmas morning, Patricia woke up to find Omari bouncing at the foot of her bed. "It's Christmas," he shouted. Patricia laughed, pulling him into a hug. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." Omari's eyes sparkled. "Mom." Patricia froze for a moment. He had called her Mom before, but this time it was different. This time there was joy in his voice. "Security. Love. Merry Christmas, Omari," she whispered back. And as they sat together, opening gifts and sipping hot chocolate, Patricia knew this wasn't just a holiday. It was home. Looking to the future, months passed. Omari grew. Not just in height, though he did have a major growth spurt, but in confidence, in trust, in love. He made friends at school. He laughed more. He started planning for the future, talking about what he wanted to be when he grew up. He believed in a future, and Patricia, she thrived. She had always thought her purpose in life was to be a doctor. But now, she knew her purpose was him. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Omari turned to her. "Mom." Patricia smiled. "Yeah, sweetheart." Omari hesitated. "Do you think she's proud of me?" Patricia felt a lump in her throat. She wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. "Sweetheart, I know she is." Omari leaned into her side, exhaling softly. I think I'm okay now." Patricia kissed the top of his head. "Me too." They sat in silence, watching the sky turn orange and gold. No more running, no more waiting. Just a mother and her son, a family. Forever.